want to talk a little bit today about something that I think all of us have made the mistake with, and that is that we've all underestimated somebody in our lives. I'm sure all of us have. Maybe it's somebody that you're close to, maybe somebody that you work with. We have all underestimated people, and we've often held back people in our lives, and maybe it's even ourselves. Maybe we've even underestimated ourselves that could accomplish something for the kingdom of God because of some opinion that we have or some belief that we have. And thankfully, Jesus isn't that way. But the fact is that our standards often underestimate what Jesus can do. So often in our lives, we see people that we think are beyond saving. And now I know that we might not say that out loud. We may not say that out loud, but deep down inside, maybe we see someone making decisions and choices that are outside of God's will, and we think, okay, God, I believe that you could save anyone, but really, that this person? I think everyone has made that mistake before, and we as humans, we have this really bad tendency of underestimating things. I found something this week, and I think I've shared this maybe once before some time ago, but there's been a lot of things throughout history that have been underestimated, and it just shows how we can be as people. Like, for instance, in 1943, one of the founders of IBM, Thomas Watson, once said that I think there's a market for maybe 5 computers in the world. Talk about underestimating, right? Right here in this room, we have probably in each little section, if you want to count our little cell phones, we have more computers than a little section in this room. Ken Olsen, who was the founder of Digital Equipment, said that there's no reason why anyone would want a computer in their home. Western Union, back in the 1800s, in 1876, when the telephone was starting to come onto the scene, said this: the telephone has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. Although I would probably say some of the younger generation would probably say that, because they're more texting than they are talking on the phone, but anyway. Or consider the words of Decca Recording. When they turned down signing the Beatles back in 1962, here's what they said. They said, "We don't like their sound and guitar music is on the way out." That's what they said about the Beatles. I bet you they really regretted that one. And then there was a man back in the late 1800s who was the commissioner of the U.S. Office of Patents who said this: "Everything that can be invented has been invented." Talk about underestimating. See, we've seen from Jesus' example so far in this series that following Jesus means preparing ourselves to follow Him. We looked a little bit about how it takes time to do that, and we saw how Jesus went out in the wilderness to prepare for His ministry. And He went beyond just talking about the gospel, but that He actually acted on the gospel in love. And that love sometimes is shown in unexpected ways and can involve unexpected people. You know what? Sometimes, though, like I mentioned, that in our homes, we can make the mistake of underestimating people, right even close to us. Maybe we look at our children and we forget the ability that they could have to show great faith. Maybe we look at a spouse and we might think that maybe there's no way that they could grow closer to Jesus. Or maybe we've written off another family member. Or maybe even at work, we underestimate people because they just don't check the boxes. We can even believe that some people we work with, well, they're never going to follow Jesus either. If you're a student at school, maybe you can make that mistake too, where maybe there's that person that you underestimate and whether they could really come to know Christ, or maybe you just underestimate them generally. You think, well, that person, they can't get this or that done. And so what do we do when we underestimate someone? Well, we cast them aside. And yes, even at the church, in the church, we can do this as well. Even in the church, we can underestimate someone. Maybe you see someone come to church and you know their background and the sins that have been in their life, and maybe you think, do they really mean this? See, we have a really, really bad habit of underestimating people. But thankfully, our Savior did not have that habit. Jesus was not the type to underestimate what God could do in the life of someone. And so in Mark chapter 2, we're just going to look at 5 verses today. In these 5 verses, we see this little instance of when Jesus meets someone who maybe most people of the culture and of the time had set aside. Jesus saw something in this man. And in verse 13 it says, "Then Jesus went out to the lake shore again, and he taught the crowds that were coming to him. And as he walked along, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at his tax collector's booth. And here's what Jesus said to him. He said, 'Follow me and be my disciple.' And so what did Levi do? Well, he just got up and followed him." See, when I look at this, and maybe hopefully when you look at this, we might not quite catch all the nuances of what's going on here. But if you look in verses 13 and 14 here, we see that Jesus, in this moment and in this circumstance, he is calling who many people of that time would consider to be the least expected. Now, it does seem that as time went along in Jesus' ministry, that he taught less and less in the synagogue. There were probably some, I guess you could say, some political or religious reasons, as some of the religious leaders weren't too thrilled with what Jesus had to say. But some of it was just practical, because there were so many people starting to follow Jesus that they didn't fit in the synagogue. They couldn't fit in these buildings, and so they would often meet outside in these places. So the crowds would come to him. And so there's no doubt, as we meet Levi, or Matthew in this passage, we see that Levi, and I think we can assume that Levi had heard of Jesus and had heard his teaching and had seen Jesus himself many times. But the problem that Levi, that Matthew would run into, is that he was often ostracized. He was often cast aside because he was a tax collector. Now, some things don't change. Even today, when we think of the 3-letter word, right? IRS. It kind of sends shivers up your spine. And if an IRS person, which they don't typically do this, but they show up at your door and knock, they probably wouldn't be given the warmest welcome by most people, would they? Okay, or when you get that letter in the mail about an audit. Okay, so we can kind of imagine a little bit of what Levi was experiencing, but there was a little bit of a difference with what Levi experienced, because Levi was working with the enemy. Now, there's different opinions about whether Levi was collecting taxes for the Romans or if he was collecting taxes for Herod, who worked with the Romans, okay? But nonetheless, he was considered a man who had betrayed his people. And tax collectors not only betrayed people, but oftentimes they were known for, let's just say, inflating the rates a little bit, getting a little bit more out of people. And so tax collectors were often very wealthy. And so Levi would not have been welcomed in the synagogue. If he had tried to go to the synagogue to worship and to hear the word, he would have been pushed out. He would have been cast out. He would have been considered a traitor and selling himself to foreigners. So here we have Levi tending to his business, collecting taxes, and what happens? Jesus comes along and he says to Levi, he says, "Hey, yes, yeah, you. I want you to follow me." Now, I can only imagine the reaction of the disciples in that moment. Are you serious? You're going to bring the IRS with us? What is wrong with you? But you know what? That can apply to any of us too. Yeah, it might not work for the IRS or whatever, but we all have a past. We've all made choices. We've all done things that we're not proud of. And yet Jesus looks at us, and what does he say? He says, "Come follow me." How is that? How is he able to do that? Because Jesus, while human, he's God, and he doesn't underestimate. He knows the potential in you and me. He knows what God can do through us. And he knew what God could do through Levi. See, Jesus wanted the man that no one else wanted. Now, there's another question here maybe you've never thought of before. Maybe you've seen this story before. But why did Matthew go? I mean, why would he want to be in this group with these other disciples who were probably going to look down on him? And why would he want to go out and go to all these different places and know that everybody knows what he had done? Why would he do that? Well, I don't know. We don't really have a good, deep understanding, but I think we can know this. I think Levi was hurting deep down. I think deep down inside he was hurting. I mean, who wouldn't? When your own people, perhaps even his own family, had given up on him, had thrown him aside because of his decision to work with the Romans. You know, there was a story, William Barclay is one of my favorite commentators. I read his commentary for all of my messages. I don't know, he just has a way, and he's from almost 100 years ago he wrote, but it's like his stories are just so timely. He tells the story of a woman from a dock district in London. I've just got a picture. I just thought it'd be kind of neat to put a picture up. But he tells the story of a woman who comes to a woman's meeting at a church. She had been living with another man and had a baby, well, not with just another man, but with a Chinese man, somebody that was of a different ethnic background, and had a baby whom she had brought with her. And she really liked the meeting. She enjoyed going to the meeting and being there. Well, one day, though, the pastor comes up to the woman and says to her, he says, "I have to ask you to please not come again." And the woman just kind of gives him a questioning look, like, what? And here's what he said. He said, the other women in this group said that they will stop coming if you continue to come. And she just looks at the pastor, just can't believe it. And she says, "I know that I'm a sinner, but is there anywhere for a sinner to go?" Now, thankfully, he writes that her story didn't end, because later she became connected with the Salvation Army, which was growing there in London. And she came to know Christ, and she grew in her faith. But I hear that story, and it breaks my heart, and it kind of gives me an idea of maybe what Levi felt. He was hurt, and he was broken. And here comes Jesus. And he says, "You know what, Matthew? Everybody else might have given up on you, but I'm not. I want you to know today that maybe in your life, in your family, at your work, at your school, people have said, you know what, I don't know about you. They might have given up on you. But Jesus says, I haven't. I haven't." And so what does Jesus do? He tells Matthew, he says, "Follow me." You know, if you think about it, of all the disciples that Jesus called, Matthew had the most to give up. Think about it. I mean, we think of Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Let's say if things just didn't go well for Jesus, what could he have done? Or what could they have done? They could have gone back to fishing. They had the family business they could have gone back to. But that wasn't so here with Matthew. When he started to follow Jesus, he left everything behind. Not only were the Jews, his ancestry, the people that he was connected with by blood, not only had they looked down on him, but now that he had left tax collecting, now he would have the Romans looking down upon him. He gave up everything to follow Jesus. I guess you could say that in some ways Matthew burned all of his boats, burned his bridges to follow Jesus, because he knew that Jesus believed in him. Now, what if Matthew had refused the call? What if he refused to follow Jesus? I mean, he would have continued in his life of having this disreputable trade, and everybody would have hated him. But instead, think of what happened to Matthew's life because he burned down his bridges and he decided to follow Jesus. We talk about him, here we are 2,000 years later. Matthew would have lived a disreputable life, and he would have died, and nobody would have ever known anything about him. But because he followed Jesus, and he recorded the words of Jesus that we have today in one of the Gospels, We know who this man is. All because Jesus didn't give up on him. You know what? When Matthew was called to follow Jesus, he knew that it was more than just following. The word in the original language is this. It's the Greek word akaluthe, which means it means to follow and go after. But the key word there the word is there at the end. It means something much deeper. It means to obey. Jesus said, "Hey, Matthew, follow and obey." And that's how his life was transformed. It wasn't just simply following Jesus around from place to place. He learned from Jesus and he obeyed Jesus. And see, that's where the transformation comes. Is by being obedient to Jesus. By learning his truth, but also exhibiting his love. And that's how Matthew's life changed. Now, if we keep reading in verse 15, it says that later, Levi, Matthew, invited Jesus and his disciples to his home as dinner guests, along with who? He invited all the people with high and good reputations in the community, right? That's what he did. No. He invited tax collectors and other disreputable sinners. There were many, and I love this note that's kind of inserted in the passage. There were many people of this kind among Jesus' followers. I want to ask you this, and I was looking at this this week when I was going through this. I'm like, are there people of that kind around me? Well, anyway, verse 16. When teachers of the religious law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with tax collectors and other sinners, they asked his disciples. You could just see the hatred in these men's heart. Why does he eat with such scum? This is the New Living Translation, a little bit more modern version. All right, I'm sure they didn't use scum, but we get the point. Okay. Why does he eat with such scum? And that's because Jesus was not afraid to hang out with the wrong crowd. He wasn't afraid to hang out with the wrong crowd. Now, Matthew was the wrong type of person. And because Matthew was the wrong type of person, Matthew also had what? The wrong type of friends, because the quote-unquote right friends didn't want to have anything to do with the wrong type of person. And Jesus knew that. And just as he wasn't willing to give up on Matthew, there's no way he was going to give up on this group of friends. See, Matthew wanted them to know that, hey guys, I want you to come and have dinner. There's this guy that I've seen do amazing things and teaches amazing things. And guess what? He loves us. And what really strikes me is it seems like there was quite the crowd there. So Matthew wasn't the only one that was looking for this love. There were other people too, and the same's true for us today. I mean, we're looking for this kind of love, but I want you to know that there's people in your family and people you work with who are looking for this kind of love too. You know, when we think and when we look in this passage of the wrong crowd, we think of people who have sinful behavior as being a part of the wrong crowd, but sinful behavior in that time was not just someone who was a sinner, but it even went beyond that. Many of the rabbis of Jesus' time thought that not only if you were a sinner that would make you part of the wrong crowd, but if you didn't follow rabbinic tradition, that made you a part of the wrong crowd. You know what, as Christians, sometimes we create our own traditions. Are your traditions holding others back from the kingdom of God? See, if you think about it, the person who committed adultery and the person who ate pork were both sinners in that time. Those who were guilty of theft and murder and those who didn't wash their hands the required number of times, well, they were part of the wrong crowd. See, in Jesus' day, it wasn't only those who were known to sin, but even those of different ethnicities. They were considered a part of the wrong crowd. You know what? Jesus, he didn't go by all that stuff. As we saw in the passage, Jesus was known to hang out with the wrong crowd. And we're going to run into the Pharisees a lot as we go here through the book of Mark, and we see it in other Gospels as well. But there's some things that you need to know about them as we go forward. And it's very, I think, telling that it's something we need to watch for in ourselves, because I think as Christians today, we can make the mistake of having some Pharisaical tendencies to ourselves, some legalistic tendencies. Many rabbis and Pharisees at that time were nationalistic and exclusive. And what does that mean? That meant that everybody else was going to hell and it's just us that are blessed and are going to heaven. You know, that's something that really concerns me. I think sometimes we see that even in our culture. I love our country just as much as you, but you know what? God loves all the nations. All the nations. Even our enemies. And that didn't make the leaders of that time comfortable. I mean, we know that many of the Jewish leaders absolutely despised Gentiles. They were kept shut out. You know, William Barclay, I mentioned him earlier, here's what he said. He said to the Jews, and I think I have it up here, he says, to the Jews, religion was a thing of endless rules. People lived their lives in an endless forest of regulations which dictated every action. They must listen forever to a voice which said to them, "You shall not. Don't do this. Don't do that." And so when Jesus came along, Jesus said, you know what? I'm going to take action. I'm going to show you love. See, oftentimes the rabbis would use rules to control others. And let me tell you, they were really, really good at it. I mean, you got to give them credit, I guess, at least there in a weird kind of way. They were good at using rules to their own benefit. They wanted people that they led to just accept what they had to say and not think for themselves. If you notice here, they didn't question Jesus' associations with those people directly. Do you notice that in the passage? It says that they go to Jesus' disciples. Why was that? Well, they knew that Jesus, he might say something that would challenge their thinking. But Jesus knew what was going on. Look in verse 17. When Jesus heard this, he told them, "Healthy people don't need a doctor. Sick people do. I have come to call not those who think they are righteous, but those who know they are sinners." See, Jesus wants to help those who want it. He wants to reach into our lives. And Matthew wanted this in his life. He knew something wasn't right, and he was waiting for that person to come into his life who was going to show them love in spite of maybe the decisions that he had made. So Jesus tells the leaders of the time, he says, how are they going to become well if the treatment to bring healing to their lives is withheld from them? See, there's two things that I think jump out to me here when I look at this. See, the Pharisees of Jesus' day, they couldn't admit their own sinfulness. They couldn't admit where they had made mistakes, but also they could not reach out to those who needed it. So not only were they unwilling to acknowledge the problem in themselves, but they were unwilling to acknowledge that maybe, and not that they need to reach out to others who also have that problem and give them hope. They weren't willing to do that. You know, I find it interesting that the very people that Jesus could do nothing for are the ones who think that they can do it for themselves. Do you see that here? We talked in our Bible study this morning about humility. And that's really what it comes down to here. He says, healthy people don't need a doctor, sick people do. I have come to call not those who think they are righteous, but those who know that they are sinners. That's humility. Acknowledging our relation to God. Now, there's some ideas out there today that kind of go in the face of what Jesus says right here in this passage, and I'm sure maybe you've even said one of these before, but I'm going to share the one that is the most popular. Have you ever heard this one? That God helps those who help themselves. You ever heard that one? Where's that at in the Word? I've never seen it. And that definitely flies in the face here of what Jesus says, doesn't it? In verse 17. What Jesus is saying in verse 17 is that I've come to help those who know they can't help themselves. And that's you and that's me. And Matthew knew that that was him. I like what a pastor of many years ago once said. He says, some want to live within the sound of a church or a chapel bell. I want to run a rescue shop within a yard of hell. I thought that's a cool way of putting it, but you know what he's trying to say? He's saying, you know what? I'm a sinner, and I've been saved, but I need to go to the places where people are sick to bring the ointment, to bring the healing that Jesus provides. And that might mean I have to get really close. And if that's what I'm going to do, that's what I'm going to do. See, Jesus' target audience was the sick. It was you and me. But if you want to dig a little deeper, it's the you and me that admit and are willing that we're sick. That's who Jesus came to heal. And so the point I want us to see today, and there's, oh my gosh, when I was going through this week, I was like, okay, God, what is something that you want me to share with your people in this? Because there are so many different directions from these 5 verses that I could just share. And I don't know, as I prayed through it, God just kind of said, okay, here's what I want you to say, and I want you to follow with me as we go through this together in the next few minutes. Following Jesus enlarges your world. See, when we follow Jesus, when we look at his example of, like we saw here in his interaction with Matthew, Jesus connects us with the people that the world has given up on. You know, in our culture today, we hear this a lot. We hear cancel culture a lot, don't we? And we like to think that it's the other side. It's not me. I'm not a cancel culture person. All of us in here at some point have been a part of cancel culture. We've canceled somebody in our lives. We've canceled political opponents. We've canceled people who we think are good enough for us. And you know what? If that is what you're in the process of doing in your life, you are making your world smaller. You're making your world smaller if you get involved in the cancel culture. Cancel culture is not a new phenomenon. It was going on in Jesus' day. We see it right here with the Pharisees and the leaders, the teachers. Don't associate with the wrong people. See, something else we see here is that following Jesus opens us up to the truths that the world has discarded. You know, like the legalists, the world wants you to toe the line. And what it does is the world often only gives us part of the story. We're told things like, love is love, and when we have to realize, no, love, it's not love is love, it's God is love. When we understand His truth, it opens up our world, and it gives us new insights into things that sometimes, like I mentioned, the world has discarded. You know, we're told in our world often that some lives are just worth being discarded. Before the womb, in the womb, after the womb. The truth is that all life is valuable. All life is valuable to God. We see that in this story, don't we? How valuable Matthew and his friends were to Jesus. All lives are valuable. See, if you love like God and you value people like God, it enlarges your world. Following Jesus also does something else. It gives you conviction. We see that in Matthew's life. He gave up everything. He burned down his bridges to follow Jesus. And for many, many years, he shared the gospel. He shared the good news, and he even died for it. And he wrote about it. And we read about it in the book of Matthew. Something else, too, is that following Jesus gives you real freedom. You know what? So many are enslaved today by the whims and the desires of culture. We've got to have the latest whatever. Clothing, idea, job, whatever it is. Our culture is just so filled with all of these things, and people are chasing after them, and we think that that's real freedom, but honestly, we're just being enslaved even more. Because we're just so preoccupied. When he was with Matthew and he invited him to follow him, I think Matthew's world just totally cleared up. He didn't have to worry about all the hurts and all of the people that were looking. He was focused on obeying and following Jesus. It became a lot more simple. Following Jesus gives you real freedom. And so my challenge for us this week is, what part of following Jesus have you disregarded? What part of following after him have you maybe laid aside? You know, where has following Jesus become more of a suggestion than a lifestyle? See, Matthew knew that it wasn't going to work to follow Jesus if it was more of a suggestion. He knew that it meant that he was going to have to live a lifestyle of obedience to Jesus. I mean, who is someone that you've given up on that Jesus hasn't and that he never will? How are you going to reconnect with that person? How are you going to finally recognize the true value that God has put in them? I mean, what are some of the truths maybe that you've laid aside, the truths from God's Word? Maybe you've laid them aside because they've made you a little uncomfortable. And you know what you've done? You've imprisoned yourself to the ideas of this world, and you're outside of the freedom of Christ. Where have you become more complacent and apathetic in your life? How has the world made your world smaller? See, the thing is when our world gets bigger, God's love grows larger. When we allow our world to get bigger, when Jesus, when he helps us to make our world bigger, the world, well, it sees more love. It grows larger in us. We understand more why Jesus went to the cross when we understand more of what his heart is about. As I've grown in my faith through the years, I've appreciated the cross more and more, not necessarily because of the act itself, but because of what was behind it. As I've understood love and what that looks like more, and let me tell you, I got a long ways to go still, but it's really made me appreciate all the more what the cross means. It's so big. It's so wide. It's so funny. We learned this song when we were little. I remember singing it in Sunday school. Deep and wide, there's a fountain flowing deep and wide. I remember that. But it's so funny, as I've gotten older, the temptation is there to make it smaller. Not so wide, not so deep, right? You know, the song doesn't really go that way, but thankfully it doesn't. But that's what the Pharisees were doing. They were singing that version. But Jesus wants to see that his love is wide and his love is deep. And so it gets larger in us and it grows larger. And imagine what would happen if we as Christ followers were more and more like Jesus, where we didn't give up on people. Imagine the avenues and the doors that would open. Rather than giving up on people in our family, we embrace them and show God's love. Instead of giving up on people at work, what do? We believe that God has created them and has given them value, and He wants to do something through them. At our school, maybe somebody that's isolated, if you see a fellow classmate that's isolated, you look at them and you can know that God created them to be loved and that God has called you to open up your world and invite them into it. And even right here in our church, God has made us to love one another. So today I want to just close with this final statement, and it's this. Don't underestimate what God can do in someone. Let God make your world bigger by seeing the potential that He has created in everyone. Make your world bigger. Make it bigger through Jesus' love.